The Drum is an ABC panel and discussion show on every weekday from 6 p.m. on Your ABC. It's Your ABC because if you're an Australian taxpayer, you pay for it. But if you're like me and you're not a left-wing progressive, then you would probably like to disown Your ABC and get your money back. Anyway, The Drum invites you to join the diverse, respectful and robust discussion with experts and opinion leaders discussing the key issues gripping or confounding Australia. Now, you might be thinking, what constitutes an opinion leader? Well, on Tuesday, one of those opinion leaders was Nick Hollis. And who's Nick Hollis? This is how he was introduced on the show.
From Melbourne this evening, queer writer and activist, campaign director at Change.org Australia and co-founder of HIV social umbrella, the Institute of Many. That is quite a mouthful. Nick Hollis, welcome to you. Great to have you there.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me.
Now, not only is Nick an opinion leader, he's also an expert on playing dress-up. And from his Instagram account, it appears he's very happy with the sight of his own reflection. Now, we'll get to Nick's expert opinions in a minute, but first I just want to set up the show. This was billed as a men's special, which of course must include a feminist, in this case ABC blowhard Jane Caro. And here's how they introduced the show at the beginning.
We're going to ask a pretty simple question, but one with no simple answers. The question is, what is going on with men? Just look at the news any day of the week. Stories of violence, terrorism, Islamist, Islamophobic, anti-Semitic, racist attacks, home invasions, child abuse, car crashes, random attacks on the street, suicides, drug overdoses, stalkers, internet trolls, gambling addicts, fraudsters. So many of these stories have one thing in common: men. There are exceptions, of course, but the data shows that men are more than 3 times as likely to be killed in a motor vehicle accident, 3 times as likely to take their own lives. Men are more likely to be assaulted or murdered, 10 times more likely to be sent to jail, 20 times more likely to sexually abuse a child. More men overdose on drugs, die of cancer, and overall, men die more than 4 years younger than women.
Now, I found that fascinating because on the one hand, the statistics they did produce don't actually back the narrative that they're trying to push, and the statistics that would prove their thesis, that there is some kind of epidemic of violent masculinity, is completely absent. None of the statistics around incarceration rates, suicide, drug abuse, murder, life expectancy, etc. are new. They've been this way for decades. And what about this observation by host John Barron?
Just look at the news any day of the week. Stories of violence, terrorism, Islamist, Islamophobic, anti-Semitic, racist attacks, home invasions, child abuse, car crashes, random attacks on the street, suicides, drug overdoses, stalkers, internet trolls, gambling addicts, fraudsters. So many of these stories have one thing in common: men.
Well, of course we see that every day in the media because the news operates on a if it bleeds, it leads model of reporting. Steven Pinker has talked about this phenomenon at length. News is about what happens, not what doesn't happen, so it features sudden and upsetting events like fires, plant closings, rampage shootings and shark attacks. Most positive developments are not camera-friendly, and they aren't built in a day. You never see a headline about a country that is not at war or a city that has not been attacked by terrorists, or the fact that since yesterday 180,000 people have escaped extreme poverty. The bad habits of media in turn bring out the worst in human cognition. Our intuitions about risk are driven not by statistics, but by images and stories. People rank tornadoes, which kill dozens of Americans a year, as more dangerous than asthma, which kills thousands, presumably because tornadoes make for better television. It's easy to see how this cognitive bias stoked by the news policy, if it bleeds, it leads, could make people conclude the worst about where the world is heading. Now, to be fair to the host John Barron, it's not unusual for him to be bereft of facts and evidence. After all, his job is just to read shit that others have written for him. But let's have a look at trends in violence in Australia today to see if we can put our finger on this rising tide of male violence. This data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics shows that the rate of violence against men has dropped 44% between 2005 and 2016. The drop for women over the same period was 19%, but then women have always been and still are less likely to be victims of violent crime. The Australian Institute of Criminology shows that homicide rates have been coming down for decades, almost halving from a high of 1.9 per 100,000 in 1990 to 1 per 100,000 in the latest year for which there's data. So unless there's statistical data to show a sharp uptrend in the last few years for which the ABC provides absolutely no evidence, then I'm going to call bullshit on this explosion in male violence. Now, the rest of the panel on this show was fairly reasonable. Some sensible things were said about males seeking support services and having a support network in place to go to when times get tough. Of course, Jane Caro was just her usual vacuous self. Her talking points consist entirely of anecdotes about her own life and what she observes with her own grandkids. Not a single fact or piece of empirical evidence ever made its way out of her mouth. And it wasn't until after the 50-minute mark that we got to the woke proclamations of Nick Hollis.
Nick, we should point out before we go as well that this is something that is becoming, there's an increasing level of awareness in same-sex relationships as well, that it's not just a man beating a wife these days.
That's right. I mean, that's pretty similar stats around family violence in the queer community. And what that tells us, I think, is that this problem is so much bigger than the individual. I think we absolutely can't stop doing that individual work to target men, to encourage them to make different choices. But if we don't look at the bigger picture and try and not put those quote-unquote bad men in one place, because when we do that, it absolves the rest of us. We need to do the hard work and for all men to put their hands up and acknowledge their misogyny, acknowledge the fact that they are profiting from toxic masculinity in some way, even if they are not violent. And we have to allow all men to dream of a place, a space, a part of the future where they're all free of that toxic masculinity. And until we do that, I think we're going to keep coming up against the exact same problems of this kind of overly individual-focused attempt at solving what is a systemic issue.
Now, call me a cynic, but I think Slick Nick is trying to profit off woke progressive talking points. So let's put aside the fact that whilst acknowledging the same rates of domestic violence in the queer community, Tricky Nicky assumes that it was all male-on-male violence, as though violence in lesbian relationships doesn't exist. But the more bizarre claim is that all men are inherently misogynistic and are imbued with toxic masculinity. You have to remember that these are quasi-religious beliefs for the ideologues that espouse this nonsense. Misogyny and toxic masculinity is the equivalent of original sin. You're born with it, but with one important exception. The social justice equivalent of original sin is that there is no redemption. You must constantly live your life by acknowledging and apologising in every moment for your inherent toxicity. Although, to be fair to Nick Hollis, he thinks we can at least dream of a world where we're all free of it.
And we have to allow all men to dream of a place, a space, a part of the future where they're all free of that toxic masculinity.
Ooh, I can't wait for that utopian dream. But I suspect that Nick isn't actually a true believer. He's just virtue signalling to the woke progressives. And this idea that we need to stop focusing on individuals that perpetrate violence and rather on the collective is a horrible idea. I wonder if Nick Hollis has made similar appeals to the consistent stream of women that make false claims of domestic violence and sexual assault. That it is not the fault of individual women that do it, but all women are complicit and furthermore are born with this need to deliberately lie and deceive for financial gain or retribution. Peter Lloyd chimed in with this kill shot. Can't wait for his hot take on jihadists. All Muslims must acknowledge that they're terrorists, even if they don't blow stuff up. Oh, and Nick had some final thoughts for us as well.
Nick, how about you? What advice?
I think you've got to be prepared to do the hard work and realise that we are all, as men, part of the problem. And if we don't interrogate our own misogyny, we've got no hope for the bad man over there in the corner.
Well, since cultural appropriation is a thing, I hope Nick interrogates his gender appropriation by looking into his penchant for appropriating female clothing. But I did take Nick's advice and interrogated my own misogyny and toxic masculinity. And here's what I realised. I don't feel any responsibility or one bit of guilt for any other man's use of violence against anyone else because I'm not them, nor am I infused with some type of anti-woman sentiment, and neither are the vast majority of men, as all studies on the subject show. Men have more respect for women than they do for each other, and women have more respect for themselves than they do for men. Now, the other interesting aspect of Nick's performance was the reception on social media. His first statement garnered just 52 retweets and over 1,400 comments, the vast majority of which were overwhelmingly negative from men and women. Just scroll through it. It's about 100 comments against to every comment for, and that's probably being generous. This is the textbook definition of getting ratioed. Now, you'd think that might prompt Nick to interrogate his own stupidity and ignorance, but no, you see, this is just evidence of the type of toxic MRAs that women have to deal with on a daily basis, even though women get less abuse online than men do, and at least half and possibly more of the abuse women do get comes from other women. But hey, Nick is not one to deal in facts. He's just here to virtue signal a popular progressive narrative. But you see, the problem with many popular progressive narratives is that they tend to disintegrate on contact with reality. And just when you thought it couldn't get any worse, the drum then doubled down with this tweet to defend brave Sir Nick's honour. A message to all those commenting on this tweet. We endeavour to have a respectful discussion on air and invite those joining the conversation online to do the same. Some of the comments below clearly breach the boundaries of civil language. So a reminder, be respectful. So let's see, you host a program in which one of your guests says that all men are inherently toxic and misogynistic, and you expect civility?
Alrighty then.
And even an ABC producer weighed in to protect Nicola from any further reprisals. Why do these types all look like they've been force-fed soy since birth? Anyway, that's the story of how Nick Whole Ass became an overnight sensation on Twitter. All it takes is an enormous amount of ignorance and a willingness to prostitute yourself on the altar of woke progressivism. As usual, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'll see you next time.